Hello, everyone, and I want to welcome you all to this uh, festival, this virtual festival that we're putting on. And I want to thank Robert Jerin for doing this presentation for us today. We really appreciate it. We're sorry we're not being to see you in person like we have in the last couple of years, Robert, but so happy that you're here virtually, and thank you very much for doing this for us, and for all of the participants that are with us today. And again, thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a little bit later here in Cleveland. I wanted to thank, first of all, Catherine for putting this together online. I think it's important to keep things going while we're in whatever we're in, the shutdown or whatever. And John, I'd like to thank John for doing the technical part. I did a Skype presentation several years ago to the Croatian Genealogy Society in Zagreb. And that was interesting because they had to have headsets to translate my English. So generally the seminar is a day-long seminar. We've done, I think at the Live Fest in Seattle, we've done, what was it, an hour or something like that, very, very short period of time, and then answered questions. So at the end of the seminar, make sure you write your questions down as we go through this. And then you'll have an opportunity at the end, and I'll introduce people also to my my handbook, Searching for Your Croatian Roots. And I saw a couple of people in the group that already have it. I checked through the names, so I'm honored to have some experienced people there. So let me mention this first photo here. Actually, the copyright in this is gone years ago, but it's from 1908 National Geographic, an article called Quaint, Curious Croatia. And it's an interesting article. These are 5 women at the port of Rijeka, or Fiume, as the Hungarians and Italians called it, and they're on a ship coming to America. And if you notice, none of them have shoes on, but you can probably see where they had, leather straps to hold their sandals on. So it's an interesting picture, and it's an interesting article because reading through the article, some of the characteristics of the Croatian people show through, and I had to chuckle to myself saying, yep, that's my grandmother, that's my family, that's how they are. So let's move into the presentation because we've got a short period of time. So what is genealogy? So here's what genealogy is. It's where you confuse the dead and bore the living. There's always somebody in a family that's really into this, and the rest of the family they get a glazed over look. But I believe it's important, especially in today's world with all of the disconnects and our modern society. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to briefly touch on all of these subjects. We're going to try to help you with your search, and if you haven't started, we'll talk about how and where to begin. And I think there are a lot of people on my Facebook group in this session here, and one of the things that new people coming to the Facebook group, they start off with, oh, I'm looking for this name. Well, what are the first names? What are the birth dates? Where did they live in the US or Australia or Canada? So it's important to work from today backwards. You can't just jump across the pond and start to do research. We're going to talk about some search tips and tricks, and I've learned an awful lot having the Facebook group for the past 5 years, and some things have just really dawned on me about our culture, about our history, about our language, about our alphabet. We're used to names with an ICH at the end, or an IC, itch. And come to find out, I get some flack from particularly the Australians that, Americans sold out and they added the H to the end. But if you go back in time before Ludovic Guy invented the alphabet, and this is key to your search as you go through the books, you will see Croatian names with CH at the end. You'll see double consonants used in names, which isn't common in the Croatian alphabet after about 1840 or 50. We're going to talk about a little bit of Croatian history. There are people that come into the group saying, well, they came from Yugoslavia in 1900. Well, okay, guys. So here's a little bit of history we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about given names. I'm doing some work for a man in Michigan. And as I found the record, he said, well, that can't be my grandfather's birth record because his name was William, his father, his great-grandfather. Well, it shows up as Vincentius, which is Latin for Vinco, And he just didn't understand why it wasn't William, name that doesn't exist in Croatia, maybe Willem. We're going to talk about some of the surnames. We're going to talk about how to use the internet, and there's a lot more on the internet in the past 10 to 15 years than there ever has been. Not everything, but there's an awful lot there. And we'll talk about some real examples. Next. Okay, so briefly, the Croatians began arriving in the location where present-day Croatia is in Bosnia between the 5th to the 7th century. Prior to that, there was a white Croatia that existed up around Krakow, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Croatia and Hungary shared common kings from 1102 to 1526, and then they were ruled by the Austrian Habsburg from 1527, when the Turks were routed out of the area, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 67 to 19. Parts of Croatia were under Venice, the Ottoman Turks, and even France. So people kind of get confused by all of the terminology used. But definitely Croatia, Yugoslavia did not exist before 1929. Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was formed in 1918 until 29, and then it became Yugoslavia. Next. Okay, 1929, Croatia disappeared from the map. The Yugoslav king founded a dictatorship in 29, and they became Banovinas, but Croatia was not on the map for the first time in centuries. 1945, the second Yugoslavia was created and ruled by the communists until 91, and 91, Croatia declares independence. If anybody hasn't read up on Croatian history, there are some good books out there. One caution that I would mention is you have to be careful of things that were put out during the communist era, because you know, there was obviously they were in the catbird seat. 1945 is also a key. Up until 1945, the church was responsible for creating all of the vital statistics: the birth, the marriage, and the death records. So what we see in the church books, those were the official records. If you order a birth certificate from Croatia, you're going to get a transcribed record from those church records. Here's a map that shows Croatia under King Tomislav in 924, and this was the greatest extent. And you'll notice that Istria, Croatia never extended beyond the river Rasha until Yugoslavia was founded, although there certainly are a lot of ethnic Croatians, and were there Croatians there before that. So you can see it was a huge chunk of territory, including Bosnia. In fact, I've got one map that refers to Bosnia as Turkish Croatia. Next. So when we look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was all organized according to language. The military units were organized according to languages. So you had different units, you know, with different main languages. But the two major languages of the empire were Hungarian and Croatian. If anybody has an old Croatian document from the interior of Croatia, you might see that it has Croatian and Hungarian. And if they were from the Dalmatian area, it may have Croatian and German, because that was ruled by Austria. So you can see there were 16, they were official languages. People were allowed to keep their languages. And you can see the ethnic layout of people. These little spots here are the Germans. And that's interesting, because Germans are interspersed all through Croatian records. When I look at Croatian records and I see the spelling S-N-A-J-D-E-R with a diacritic over the S, Schneider. So that's a Croatianized German name, as is Wolf and so on. Next. This is also the picture on the left of those dapper guys in their noshnia, their folk dress, with their, what do you call these, stampa, the canes, and their man bags, which torbas. It was traditional for men and women to have those bags. This is actually in the market, when the market was on Ban Jelačić, before the Dolots was built. This is 1908, and these guys are there from the village. And if you look in the back, you can see that there's a lady back here in in more urban dress, Western dress, if you will. So she was living in the city. These guys were from the village. And on the right, you can see World War II. That's from Split. And those are, one guy in a military uniform and one guy in his Sunday best, whatever that was. Next. So how did they choose the port that they came to, and how did they choose the ship line that they went to? Typically in towns, there were steamship lines. The North German Lloyd's was the largest, and this is the North German Lloyd's in Croatian. It was the largest steamship company porting immigrants from Europe to America. And by the way, the steamship companies made their money from those low-cost steerage passages, third-class passages, where they were under the main deck in these crowded places. They certainly didn't make the money from the wealthy people who had the big staterooms. So whoever was selling a steamship ticket in the town nearest them is probably where they got the ticket. And we all know about Ellis Island. Ellis Island was actually an immigration station that opened in 1892. Prior to that, Clinton Castle, or Castle Garden at the tip of Manhattan, was the immigrant processing station. So typically the ship would come to the port in New York, and I just learned that some ships may have gone across the river to Hoboken, New Jersey. There were docks there also, but they still listed it as New York arrival. So any American citizen or any immigrant who had enough money could disembark the ship at the dock and go on into America. Those immigrants with less than a certain amount of money were transported by ferry to Ellis Island. Usually it was 4 or 5 hours and they were processed through. And I've got to say this, I keep saying this, and this I'll die before this myth goes away. There were no names changed at Ellis Island, none. There were mistakes made on manifests, but those manifests were created at the port of departure, and the information was taken from the immigrant's travel paper. Now, let me mention one more thing while we're talking about this. If you haven't found your immigrant ancestor, one possibility is they use somebody else's travel papers. And I verified that through locating immigration papers, a certificate of arrival, and a different name on the manifest. And you know how Croatians are. Hey, if we can save a nickel, we're going to save it. I mean, we have better things to do with our money. So they would share passports, and before about 1925, 29, there were no photographs, just a physical description. So it was relatively easy, and America was looking for cheap labor to, work in the, wherever, the ports, the mines, the forests, the railroads, wherever they went to. So that's an example of an ad that you would see, that says Zagreb on there. So obviously that was from Zagreb. When the immigrant came to the port, and I've had people say, well, my ancestor couldn't speak English. They couldn't read. The fact is that in 1860, the Austrian Empire passed a law that all children must be schooled for 4 years of primary education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which was sufficient for the average farmer, the average peasant, to survive in the world. Now, were they all schooled? No. Some of them couldn't read and write. When they got to Ellis Island, this is another interesting point, because our Croatian Heritage Museum in Cleveland, we did an exhibit, and I found signage at Ellis Island and tags that had the major languages of the day. And one of those major languages was Croatian. Also at the island, and I don't know about other immigrant ports, but I imagine that if there were enough people that they would have translators. Theodola, I can't say that name, LaGuardia, who became mayor of New York, was actually an interpreter at Ellis Island. He spoke Italian, Yiddish, German, and Croatian. And he actually worked at the port of Rijeka for a period of time before he came back to America. So it wasn't as loosey-goosey as people think. You came, you couldn't speak English, and all you did was smile and got the name Smiley. That just didn't happen. So it's possible that your ancestor used somebody else's passport, or the manifest is so badly damaged that the name can't be read, or and this is a major problem, mistranscribing of the record. When I look at a record, if I'm not familiar with a country or an ethnicity, and I look at the name, I may not see that it's Ivan. Forever and a day, I'm seeing Ivan transcribed as Joan, J-O-A-N. And when I go there, well, yeah, okay, I can see it's Ivan. Maybe at first glance, if I didn't know, I would think it was Joan. So there are a number of reasons. Names were reversed on the manifest. Sometimes it was surname first, given name second. So searching, sometimes putting the surname in the first name box, you can be successful finding manifest. Okay, next. Actually, Austria-Hungary didn't want immigrants to leave. And these records exist. This is a request for, I can't see the name on here, but so this person was seeking to emigrate from Austria-Hungary. This is from the Karlovac archives, and don't go asking for them because they're not indexed. You'd have to sit there and file through these. But this person was asking for permission to leave the country. Number one, if he was a male and he was, about 21 years old, he had to serve 2 years of military duty. Now, I've noticed that they allowed people that were 16, 17, 18 to leave, and that never came up as an issue. But if they were of draft age, they would not be given permission. Did they commit any crimes? Did they own any debts? Did they owe anybody any money? So that was the first part of the process. And then they would apply with the steamship company. So it was an involved process to leave the country. Next. These are a couple of examples. On the left is a putovnica, and that means basically to travel or travel document. So there you can see that this is, it talks, I love this language, in the name of the king, the apostolic, whatever, just all this colorful language. So you can see on there that Croatia is listed as one of the kingdoms of that empire. That's from, oh, actually, this is somebody called Nicholas Tesla. I don't know if it's the real Tesla. I've actually found his birth record, but God, anybody that can translate Cyrillic, I'd buy your lunch. On the other side, on the right side, is a military passbook. If a man had served his 2 years of military duty, active duty, he was still bound for another 10 or 11 years of reserve status. And he had to have this military book. And actually, the inside pages of this were stamped by the Hungarian consul in Cleveland at that time. So he was reporting to the consul during his time here in Cleveland. That could also be used to travel on. So those were two travel documents that were typical. I've heard people say, well, they didn't need passports, and maybe they didn't, but I have my great-grandmothers from 1894. Okay, next. So how did they get to the port? Well, typically they took the train, and you can see the rail lines going to the major ports. The major port used out of Europe, for Croatia even, was Bremen. And if you look at the route here, if they left from Trieste or from Rijeka, they had to go all the way down here. They would probably stop somewhere in Genoa or maybe North Africa, finally make their way out of the Straits of Gibraltar, and then the ship would head north because that's the shortest distance, is to go north where the circumference is smaller. But Bremen was a huge port. There were other ports, Genoa, Trieste, Fiume or Rijeka, Havre, France, Antwerp, Belgium, Liverpool, England. And also, here's another point. People are looking for manifest with immigrants going back to Europe. There was no requirement to save that documentation. The only requirement was to save the incoming immigrants because they used it later for naturalization purposes. You may find an occasional person listed on a departure manifest, but there was no need to keep those. So very few of those exist. The only other possibility is if they traveled back through Liverpool, the Liverpool arrival manifests are available. Next. Okay, so there you can see the ports: Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp, Le Havre, Liverpool, Genoa, Trieste, and Rijeka. Next. Okay, so there you can see the ports of departure. That's from the 1900s. By far, Hamburg and Bremen combined were the largest, and then next came those other ports. So very few left from Fiume and Trieste. Next. Okay, here's just a picture of an example of an old railroad station in Čakovec. So they would get on the train, and generally when they bought a ticket, it was all inclusive. So they would buy their ticket to travel to the port. They would buy their ticket to travel from the port to their destination in America. On the ship manifests, at least the ones after about 1900, there's a column that asks the question, do you have a ticket to your destination? And if they didn't have a ticket, they may be detained. There's a list of detainees, and they may be detained because of illness. They may be detained of any number of reasons. The most common, if anybody's seen a detained passenger list or likely to become, a special inquiry, LPC is written on many of them, and that simply means likely to become a public charge. They weren't going to come here and go on any kind of public assistance. It didn't exist. And there's the steerage section of the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. And here's my great-grandmother's passport from 1894. Next. Okay, so when they got to the inspection station, and the rules became stricter over the years. They would test mental capability. They would do some physical tests. They're checking for eye problems. What do you call those? I can't think of those eye problems that people have. But anyway, sometimes you'll see them listed on the manifest. And here over to the right, this is a card that the immigrant would obtain, and on here was the Croatian language. And there's an inspection card. Next. Oh, and again, I'll say this again. Was your grandpa's name changed at Ellis Island? Next. So, and people argue about this because the family story says, hey, that's what my family said, I believe it. Well, okay, believe it. Just keep in mind why you may not find them. Next, okay. Oh, back one. So, one more, there you go. Okay, so 4 basic waves. The first recorded Croatians came on Columbus ship, according to Adam Materovich, he's the great-grandfather of Croatian genealogy in America. The first waves went to California and Louisiana, and probably Washington State also. And then the Great Wave of people coming from Europe, period, was from 1870 to 1913. Once the war started, Austria-Hungary wasn't going to allow people to leave, and even though we didn't officially enter the war immediately, I think we always sided with England. So there was very little immigration during the war years. The second wave, post-World War II, and then, or post-World War I and post-World War II, and then the third wave during the Croatian Spring, 60s to 70, when things loosened up, and then the latest wave, quite a few Bosnians. Next. So like I said, begin working in the present, and if you've got living relatives, God, get a tape recorder out and turn it on and let them talk. And I know how Croatians are. Some people just, some of the old people say, well, why do you want to know this? I don't want to talk into that. And then family postcards, letters, Bibles, photographs, military records, even family stories. And family stories may or may not be true, but you still want to record them. I love people that come looking for royalty, and I say, well, okay, that's great, but your grandpa came to work in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. So next. And let me stop there. When we talk about royalty in Croatia, or actually nobility, there's an upper level of nobility, and those people don't pay taxes, or they didn't pay taxes. They had land, they had money. There's a second level of nobility, and you'll find them in Jumbarak, and you'll find them in Turopoya, around Velika Gorica. When you go through the records, and if anybody hasn't seen this, so you'll see the given name, and you'll see the surname, and between them is the letters PL that stands for nobility, Plementis. So that those people have noble status, and if they were at the upper level, well, they had land and they had money and they had voting rights. If they were that lower level, they had no voting rights, and they probably didn't have a lot of money. But it's still neat to see that. So look at birth records, census, wills, naturalization records. Some of them are on the internet, some aren't. Naturalization records you can basically get from the National Archive branches around the country. Military service records. Now, let me stop there. U.S. military draft records. Even though they would not have drafted an alien, every man of age during World War I and World War II were required to sign up for the draft. If an alien chose to be drafted, chose to enter the Army, he could bypass one of the steps of naturalization. So there was somewhat of an advantage to serve that military duty. The Second World War, and this is interesting because you'll find somebody born in 1870 or 1877 who's in the U.S. World War II military draft, and they say, oh, my grandpa served in the military. No, in fact, they called it the old man's draft registration. Anybody born between 1877 and 1890 something, never drafted, but they were required to register, and there's some good information off of those. Local church registers in the U.S., tax records. When you talk about church records, even in the U.S., I know in Cleveland, civil registration of births didn't take place until after 1908. When my mother was born in Pennsylvania in 1921, her only record of birth was her baptism record. So many times you'll have to use those as a birth record. Tax records, marriage records, death records, newspaper clippings. And let me say this about death records. They're some of the most inaccurate records available because the person who really knew is gone, and their descendants or whoever is filling out the obituary or the death certificate has little real knowledge of them. Fraternal lodge records, if they belong to the Croatian Fraternal Union or any of the Slavonian lodges, there may be records there, letters, postcards, family Bibles. I talked about ship manifests, photographs, city directories, passports. By the way, Ancestry has a business directory for Croatia from the 1900s. I was typing a Croatian name in, and up popped this German directory of businesses in Croatia. So every once in a while you may see that pop up, not often. Social Security applications. Last I checked, they were $27 to order it. And on that Social Security application, you will have the immigrant's name, the name of his parents, and where he was born. Now, one word of caution, it may just say Croatia, but most of them will also have a town or a village or a city. And when we talk about birthplaces, my grandfather, when he immigrated, on his ship manifest, it said he came from Oza. Well, he didn't come from Oza. He never lived there. That's where the municipal office was. That's where the parish was. He came from a little tiny village called Vinivar, and his brother listed that on his ship manifest. And then if someone searched ahead of you, but just be careful because you'll find all sorts of things that people post on Ancestry or Family Search that are incorrect, but it's still good information. Next. This is one of the things when you're searching for names, and I mentioned this about the I and the J. So Ivan being transcribed as Javon or Joan even. So L and S, and you can see that those are some of the ones. One of the interesting ones, I started doing searches with partial names. So for instance, if I'm on Family Search, and if you're not on Family Search, you need to be there, it's free. You just need a username and password, but there's a ton of information there. So, for instance, here's an example that I always use, and that's the name Katic, K-A-T-I-C. Well, I began the search without the C at the end, just K-A-T-I and an asterisk, and up pops these names, Katie and Cadio. Well, when I looked at the manifest, they're Katic. The transcriber, modern day transcriber, misunderstood that it was a C at the end and not an E or an O. Lowercase u and lowercase n, it depends on how the writer, how far apart the humps are in the end. Could look like a U. Next. So the information on the manifest, first and last name. Some manifests, the first name is in the first column, surname in the second column. Some it's reversed, and some people just they mix names. They put the given name in the surname column. So keep that in mind as you're searching ship manifests. Occupation, and you know, most of our ancestors, you'll see that they were laborers or you know, homemakers or you know, whatever. On the manifest, there's a column for nationality. Now, the definition of nationality, as we may sometimes use today, is not the blood, not the ethnicity. It's where does that person hold citizenship. So that's what they mean by nationality. And you'll see that Croatians on the older manifests were all listed as Hungary or Austria. And people get all bent out of shape by that. But then they added a column. The title is race or people. And the definition given at Ellis Island is the language spoken by the alien or the people from which they sprang. So that's where we look for Croatians. And it's also interesting to note that most of the Serbs from Croatia that immigrated before World War II actually came from either the Slavonia area or the Vojvodina area or Lika or around Karlovac, and their race was listed as Croatian. I figure they'd lived there for 300 years, so that's why. So it will have the last residence and the relative's name. Sometimes on the 2-page manifest you'll find that, and that's useful. And sometimes it will even give the house number. It will say you know, like Omiš 3. So in Croatia, many of the villages still don't have street names. They just use the village name and a house number. So when you see house number, when you see a number there, that's their actual address. When you go to church records, it will have KBR, meaning Kuchny Broj, house number 3 or 4 or whatever. Now, does it correspond to house numbers today? Maybe, but not likely, because villages grew or shrunk and numbers were changed. It will have the destination and the person at the destination, and then it will have the person's physical description, and they ask a series of questions. I can't believe anybody would say yes to any of these, but they ask the question, are you a polygamist or are you an anarchist? And I've never seen anybody answer yes. I mean, that's ridiculous. Next. So here's a single page manifest. You can't see this very well on the screen, but it's got the immigrant's name in a single space here. And here they've got the surname and the given name, and then the age in years and months, the gender, their occupation. Are they able to read and write in their native language? Somebody said, well, my ancestor couldn't read English. I said, no, that wasn't the question. Are they able to read and write in their native language? And then the country, and let me see. People. So race or people. It's interesting to note, I know this is not an Italian seminar, but even today, there's a difference from North to South Italy, and they would differentiate on the manifest North Italian or South Italian. Why, I don't know. And then the town where they last lived, and then it goes through, and it's got the persons they're going to. So this one does not have, a one-page manifest does not have a name of a person back home. Next. So here's a 2-page manifest, might be a little bit easier to read. And you can see here it's got um, this man's mother, Anna Pechel, a place called Beska. SHS is the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or Srpska, Hrvatska, Slovenska. And he's going to Benville, Pennsylvania. But notice this arrow. These numbers above this are an indication that this person sought naturalization in 1942. So they would go back to the arrival and they would verify that the person was in the US long enough to become a citizen. Didn't matter what the name was, because I think I'll show you a manifest where the person used somebody else's travel information. So 1942, and this first number is the INS district 11, which gosh, I think that's Chicago, and then this series of numbers here is a certificate of arrival. So you may be able to find that in a naturalization database. Come down to this is the second half of this person's arrival, and it says that he was in Chicago from 1908 to 1910, and in Chicago, Illinois, and now he's going to a brother-in-law, so it gives a brother-in-law's name here, in Renville, Pennsylvania. And then this is where they ask a series of questions and their physical description and their birthplace. Next. Okay, so manifest markings. There's a Jewish genealogy website. And if you just Google manifest markings, you'll come to this page that explains all of this cryptic stuff. So you can see here that under these stamped letters is the word SI. So they were held for a special inquiry. This person was deported. This person was admitted. Now, the special inquiry questionnaires don't exist. They've got a few, and it's interesting to read them, but you just won't find them. Next. Here's one. This took me. I had an infection this day, and it took me most of the day to find this guy. So you look at this. Here's Dane Knezovic, and then you go to the next one, and here's Krunoslav Vajdahar. Well, guess what? And then here's Jovo Klajic. This name right here, Krunoslav, is a given name. That should have been over here in the second column. So I began to search because, you know, I found the man's naturalization paperwork, and I found his real name. He went by Steve in the U.S., and he went by Vidak instead of Vajdahar, and actually he was from Gospic. So here you can see INS District 11, which was Chicago, the certificate of arrival number, 1941, and 505. 505 is their code for there's a discrepancy between this name and the person the name is using. Now, did they need legal paperwork to change their names in those days? No. They could just change it, and that was it. So there, this person, and it, you know, took the better part of, well, actually it took longer than that to find it. But so how did I search for this guy? I found out that his wife and his brother-in-law were from Gospic. Well, his family story was that he was from Zagreb, and that he came on the Lusitania. If you've heard of the Lusitania, that was the ship bombed by the Germans. So it was a famous ship. Zagreb's a big city. I mean, you know, when I travel, I tell people I'm from Cleveland. Well, I'm not. I'm from Shaker Heights. But everybody knows, you know, where the place on the lake is. So I searched Stephen Morris's one-step search, and I looked for men arriving during a certain time period, arriving from Gospic, birth years between such and such. And I already found out his first name was Krunoslav. So I put in Krun, just a partial name, in the given name column, and it didn't come up. So then I put it in the surname column, and bingo, there he was. Krunoslav Vajdahar. So they made a mistake on the manifest. Next. Okay, here's my favorite one, Stojan Demic, Croatian Serb. You can see that 1940, in the Cleveland INS district, he was issued a certificate of arrival, and it said specifically he came on June the 4th, 1913 on the SS Cleveland. That ship did arrive that day, but old Stoyan was nowhere to be found on there. One year after Christmas, after Christmas dinner, I spent about 3 hours going through the manifest. And finally, I searched for, because if you look where he was born in a place called Biela Voda, which is below Karlovac. So I put in a partial name. I put in the man's birth years. I put SS Cleveland on that date. And after a while, here came, go to the next, and you'll see what came up. See that name there? So on that, actually it's May 23rd, 1913. If we go back one, look at the certificate of arrival number. Where is it here? Right there, right at the top. 108991. Go to the next slide. Look at that, 108991. This Peter Kukuletso, and I couldn't find any trace of any name like this in America, but it does exist in Croatia. And there's that notation, 505, there was a discrepancy. He became a citizen, even though he came under a different name. Next. Okay, so the church records, they're in a number of places throughout Croatia. At the end of World War II, the communists took all the church records from the churches and put them in the National Archives. Or they put them in regional archives. For instance, the Serbian Orthodox records around Karlovac and Lika in that area, many of them exist in the Karlovac archives. So you may have to go to the individual archives. The Zadar archives just came online, and I haven't tried it yet, but it's actually a searchable database on the Zadar archive website. Family Search has 1,200 churches, synagogues, some civil records, and they've got something called military records, but the military records are only birth, deaths, and marriages on those military reservations or forts or whatever they were. But there's quite a trove there. What Family Search has, and they were filmed by the Mormons before the Homeland War in 1990. They did not film everything. So when you go to a church record, you may see that it doesn't cover the year that you need, but they probably exist at the archives in Zagreb or at the church. Next. Oh, and by the way, Family Search, if anybody's been there, they already know that most of those parish records have not been indexed, so you need to find the parish and you need to search page by page. So what are the alphabets? Well, Glagolica, and for me that's a letter at a time to interpret it. Before about 1850, records were in Latin, and that's where you'll find, for instance, my grandfather, his name was Mirko, and I had a good Croatian friend whose husband was Mirko, and she said, oh, that translates to Emmerich, and other Croatians said, oh, no, it doesn't. Mirko is actually a pre-Christian name, pagan name, if you will. But somewhere a priest said, oh, okay, this is Sveti Emmerich, or Saint Emmerich. My grandfather's birth record, or baptism record, it says Mirko, and then under it, it says Sveti Emmerich. Serbian Orthodox records are in Cyrillic most of the time, or there are some places with Croatian Cyrillic, and I found a bunch of them somewhere on the coast, but I can't find that database now, and it's different than the Serbian Cyrillic. Next. Oh, one person, when I directed them to the church records, they said, well, are they in English? Oh my gosh. So here's a typical example. Most of the later records look like this. This is a birth and baptism record. By the way, in continental Croatia, the interior part, not talking about the Dalmatian area of the islands. Croatians typically did not and do not have middle names. So when they were born, they were baptized either the same day or within a day or two of their birth. It was important, being a Catholic, that that baby is baptized because of original sin, I guess. If they weren't baptized and they died, they would not be buried in the Catholic cemetery. So you'll see that they were baptized, and I would imagine it was done at the church or the chapel in the village. I would imagine that the father and the godparents were there. The mother was probably, well, I don't know, some of those Croatian women were tough. Maybe they went too. So you'll see the name, Ime, and you can see that most of these don't have middle names. And then it says, this column is zakonit ili nezakonit, legitimate or illegitimate. So were the child's parents married when the baby was born? In this case, they were. You'll see the father's first name and given name, and then you'll see the mother and her maiden name. It will have the abbreviation RODJ, Rojani. So that's her birth name. So you can pick up the birth name there. Sad to say, when you get to the oldest Latin records, you don't see the mother's maiden name listed. So sometimes we have no idea. So here's the where the person lived, their address, their house number. There's that KBR. And then the godparents. And it also gives their status. If anybody can see that, it's Seljak or Seljats, which is literally farmer or peasant farmer. The name of the priest, and then a notation column here. It's interesting to note in some of these, now this, let's see, this child died in 1892. So you can see over the name, you'll see that little cross or little X. That's an indication that that person died. And in the notation column, you can see the actual death date. So you can go to the death books then and find the death record. Also in that column, you'll see vienchany, which means marriage, or umli, which means death later on. So if the priest was really doing his job in that village, that column would be filled. Unfortunately, many of them aren't. So that's an example of what you'll find on a typical church record. Next. Here's a marriage record, and the same thing, the date. Notice they got married in January. I found that typical weddings occurred late in the year or early in the year when the harvest was done and before the planting. So, you know, they got all of their work done. Now they were looking for, companionship. They were looking to start a family. They needed help around the house or whatever. The names of the couples, where they lived, and there's and this is Veria, which is up near Đorđevac, and I don't know what that is, 377 and 290. Okay, so he lived at house 377. She lived at house 299. Their religion, Roman Catholic. When you get to the Žumberak area, if anybody's familiar with the Byzantine or Greek Rite Catholic Church, that's actually under Rome. So you'll see in some of those records, you'll see RK, meaning Roman Catholic, or GK, meaning Greek Catholic. So you'll find records for either one in the same church record. Their ages at marriage, and were they newlyweds or were they married before? You'll see an awful lot of udova or udovats, meaning that they were widows or widowers. The parents' names, and you'll see an indication whether the parent is living or not. They'll have the letters for letters POK there if the person's deceased. The names of the witnesses, the priest, and then this last column, it says, well, did they announce the wedding 3 times, as is the Catholic tradition? So that's a typical marriage record. Next. And here's a death record. So you'll see the death date here, the name of the person, and their next of kin. You can see this person was 61 years old, and she was Kata was Suprug or Supruga, um, the wife of Blaj. And this is from Viria, house number 942, and the cause of death. And it's interesting when you go through there in the 1918, 1917, 18, you'll see Spanish influenza listed an awful lot. And then did they receive the sacrament? Oh, okay. So where were they buried? So this is the church's cemetery, and then who performed or who officiated this. Next. Here's one, Spanish influenza, SP Groznica. And that entire page, just like here in the US, just lots of people dying from that. Next. Now, I haven't delved into these very much, but in 1828, and these census records are on Family Search, they're not indexed, other than by location, Zagreb or Karlovac or whatever. And these are interesting because it only gives the name of a person who paid taxes. So in that record, you won't find landless people there. You won't find some of the upper class because they were exempt from taxes. So they didn't pay taxes. And it will give an accounting of all the people in their house. It will give, males and females and servants and whatever. And then it also gives a number of sheep and horses and vineyards and land. So it's typically a tax census. And there's some value to that. Next. So did it have an H at the end? Well, it depends on the era. So there's that ch that we see at the end of Croatian names in Croatia. And then people added the H here, and I know some recent immigrants had added the H because they wanted their name to sound correct. I have a good friend that he came as an orphan after World War II, and his name is Spiranovich, and he put an H at the end. And one of the hot-headed Australians in our group said, "Well, why did he do that? Why did he sell out?" Well, he simply said, "I didn't want to be called Spiranovic. I wanted people to understand it's an itch at the end of it." So the current Croatian alphabet, and you can see here it was invented around 1840. So prior records, it was CH at the end. And that's only dawned on me in the last couple of years that, hey, that's a fact. The alphabet's changed. Next. Okay, here's an example, and here's an example. And believe me, I was no huge scholar in high school, and I didn't take Latin. But I've learned how to get by it. So you can see here, and if the priest was really doing his job, he would underline the subject of the action. In this case, let's see, this is a baptism for Stephanos, or we'd say Stjepan or Stipe today, Piškalić. And look how they spelled it, 2 L's and an H at the end. You wouldn't see that today in Croatia, but that's how it was done in the 1800s. And excuse me, I didn't put the date on here. But you can see typical names, Barbara and Antony, Andrea, Katharina. So names changed with time. Next. Okay. Oh, I can't believe that. Did all that in 1 hour. Here's my email address. You're welcome to send me an email, and I'll try to give you a hand with it. And also and I see a few people on here who have purchased this book recently. It's a series of PDF files. I started this from my seminars because people said, well, do you sell the seminar notes? So I put this book together, and it's growing from there. But there's a ton of information in there. But there's my email address. Just think of the curse of King Zvonimir, that Croatia would not be independent for 1,000 years, and it almost made it. It was 900 some years before it became independent again in 1991.
Any final thoughts?
Well, there's a lot more to this. If for those in the on the Facebook group, do you mind if I mention my Facebook group page?
Absolutely, you can.
Okay, Croatian Heritage and Genealogy. It's a wide range of topics. Primarily, it was started as genealogy, but there are also news articles, travel articles, anything but political arguments. I do not allow those. I don't allow ethnocentric posts. I've been called all sorts of names for not allowing free speech, but everybody gets the rules when they join. But Croatian Heritage and Genealogy, if you search for that on Facebook, when you sign up, you just answer a series of questions, so you know the ground rules, and join. And if anybody posts, let me go back to this. If you're posting looking for a family, let's say I'm looking for today, somebody was talking about Stanic family. Post the given names of the immigrants, post their birth dates or approximate birth dates, and post where they lived in the U.S. What I've noticed is it saves a lot of time. Everybody wants to help people, so they start guessing at things. Well, could it be this? Could it be that? I've got this name that sounds like that, and are we related? So give as much information as you can, because we don't know as much as you know, even though you're looking for information. But yeah, if you're not on that group, please go there, and then from there, there's some region-specific groups that have sprung up. I notice Judy's on here. I think she's on in the Merkopie group. So there are some very good people. We've got a number of people from Croatia. We've got people from Australia, from New Zealand, from South America, South Africa, just all over the world. And most people are very helpful at trying to uncover some information.
Excellent. Yeah, I am a member of your group as well, so I find it very interesting and informative when I have a chance to look through it and read it, for sure. Well, Robert, thank you for your time. I think this has been very informative. I know I learned a lot during the session to help read these records. I've got some of these records, and they a lot of marks and things on there that sometimes don't make a lot of sense, but now they do. So thank you for that. And before we end the call today, I wanted to give Catherine just another minute with any final thoughts for this session.
Well, again, thank you, Robert, for doing this for us. This was very informative, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it very, very much. And hopefully we'll see you next year at Croatia Fest in Seattle. Absolutely. I'll be there. All right. Thank you very, very much. And I've got to mention this. I did go over my time again this year. I'm keeping up my record.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
And everybody in the group, thanks, and stay healthy.
Thanks,
and we'll
Catherine.
See you someplace sometime.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everyone who attended. I hope you found today's presentation informative and useful, and have a great rest of your day.